It's a pleasure to see so many of you here on a rainy morning. I apologize, I come from Belgium. I seem to have brought the rain. My name is Sandrine Dixson-Declève, and I have the esteemed honor of being the co-president of the Club of Rome. My fellow sister in this journey is unfortunately not here today, Mampela Ramphele, and I will speak to you a little bit about why she's not with us. It is therefore my responsibility to try, and that is a very, very difficult task, to be here before you representing two women. One, myself, who was born into a Belgian-French family, and for some of you who understand history, you know our links to this continent are not so good. With a very strong colonial past and a relationship which was one of ownership rather than partnership or friendship or respect. Mampela, who many of you know, is deeply, deeply tied to this country for all the right reasons. She's tied to this country because she has fought for a vision with her partner, Stephen Biko, who unfortunately saw the end of his life much too soon and left a widow with a young son. And today we are with her as she grieves the loss of Steve Biko's sister, Nobandile Biko, who unfortunately passed, from what I understand, yesterday. Why is this passing so important, like so many others that have passed before her? Because we've just lost a link to history, a very important understanding of what it is to fight for something that you believe is right, to do everything you possibly can to join your sisters and your brothers, to try to honor compassion, respect, and freedom. Today was supposed to be a happy day. It was supposed to be a day when myself and Mampela came up here before you to show two things. One, that women are now at the head of the Club of Rome. And two, that an African woman with a very different past to my own, and one which is and has been much more embedded in the right essence of humanity, can rule with another woman, myself, who does actually understand the pain and suffering of when that humanity is totally forgotten. Understand because myself, having a grandfather who actually suffered 3 years in a concentration camp as a resistance fighter, he too understood the vision of what a real humanity could look like. He too fought for something that he believed in. And hence I believe that it was our destiny to find each other, myself and Mampela, to now come into the greatest existential risk that we've actually ever faced, which is the fact that humanity has forgotten that it is the keeper of this planet, not the owner. That it must remain a friend, a supporter, and a part of this very important gift that we've been given, which is our globe. We are here only to honor that purpose and to remember that we must love our neighbor. Our neighbor, whether it be a bee, whether it be a person, no matter what form that neighbor takes. So I welcome you with that as the core, I hope, of your essence as you move through today's proceedings. The Club of Rome was started by a very distinguished businessman, Aurelio Pichet. At a time in the 60s when there were many other crises, at a time when there were many questions around what is the true fate of humanity? Why are we fighting in a war which seems completely ridiculous, like the Vietnam War? Why are we imprisoning people? How can we learn from the 60s, where people stood up because they felt that something was morally wrong in the globe? The limits to growth was the product of some of that thinking. The product of trying to understand the deep inequalities between people and the planet, between the striving for prosperity, some who understood that prosperity was also to share, not just to take. The understanding that actually growth and the measurement of growth was completely the wrong indicator for how human beings should live their lives. And that there should be a greater purpose, which again is to live within the boundaries of our globe and our planet and to respect one another. So I am now going to try to read the speech that Mampela was going to deliver to you as she welcomed you to her country. She was so proud that the Club of Rome had decided, first of all, to elect a South African woman as its president, but secondly, to decide that its first great summit outside of Europe would be here in her country. The cradle of humanity. And in her honor, today's Club of Rome event is about the Club of Home. I now call this the Club of Home event, because we have all, and now I'm losing my necklace, sorry. We have all come home. So bear with me as I try to take on the persona of our dear Mampela as I read her words. This is the summit of our joint future, Lessons from Africa. Welcome to my beloved country, to the mother continent of Africa, the natal home of humanity. And now she's put in a beautiful phrase, which I cannot read for her in her own tongue. I apologize. I will maybe try. Niam kele kele, le amogotswe, hule is alnan welcome. I hope I did justice. Special welcome to the members of the Club of Rome and their partners who chose to come from all parts of our globe, of their home continent, for this historic first ever conference in South Africa. We heartily welcome our new partners, the East-West Philanthropy Forum, and their leader, Mr. Fukutake. Welcome. We look forward to engaging with you and finding ways to work together to shape a joint future we can all be proud of. We would also like to welcome all participants who have come to join us from other parts of our country, continent, and the world for this important summit. A very special welcome to young leaders from across the globe who spent yesterday reflecting on the theme of our conference, our joint future, Lessons from Africa. We look forward to the infusion of your energy, passion, and ideas into the panel discussions today, as it is vital that we work with all of you to shape a joint future that you and the generations after you deserve. We would also want to publicly thank the Eindhoven family for their generosity in hosting us here today and I don't see you. Is Marietta here and Angus? No, I'm sure they will join us later. But thank you to the Eindhoven family already for hosting us here for several days. We cannot thank them enough for their sponsorship of the accommodation and venue for this historic conference. Siya Bulele. As a family, you continue to be a model of how private sector players can partner with others in both the public sector and civil society to promote sustainable futures. We are very grateful to the Institute of Futures Research of Stellenbosch University for co-hosting this conference. And Morne, wherever you are, thank you. We look forward to hearing from our director, Professor Morne Mostert, about the work the IFR done, and Morne, who's also been working with us at the Club of Rome, the Club of Home. A big thank you to Professor Mark Swilling of the Sustainability Institute of the University of Stellenbosch, who will host us for dinner under the African skies. Hopefully it won't pour this evening. We are grateful for his willingness to share his dream embedded in the Sustainability Village, where he will show us around later this afternoon. The wisdom of the ancients tells us that when you lose your way, go back to where you started. We have lost our way as a human community. The biosphere is under severe stress. It is appropriate that we come back to where the human story began, to discern the lessons from the mother continent. We need to harvest the wisdom that enabled humanity to evolve here. We need to understand what went wrong and why. But we also need to embrace the complexities as we explore how we emerge from the climate emergencies we have brought upon ourselves. The wisdom of Africa lies in holding on to the truism that is Ubuntu, the I am because you are. This wisdom nurtured between us, many of us who grew up in rural villages and townships across our continent, and how we understand the inextricable connectedness and interdependence that define the essence of our humanity. Ubuntu is expressed differently across Africa. To capture this truism, Unhu in Shona, Boto in Sesotho, Ubuntu in northern Tanzania and Uganda. Biologists have also come to value this indigenous wisdom as they delve deeper into their scholarship. I am indebted to Leslie Green, Professor of Environmental Humanities at the University of Cape Town, for introducing me to the work of Andreas Weber, whose book, Enlivenment Towards the Poetics of the Anthropocene, expresses the Ubuntu truism within our biosphere. Thus, the individual can exist only if the whole exists, and the whole can exist only if the individual exists. Weber represents a new approach to biology that acknowledges aliveness as the pivotal point of a future human self-understanding. He welcomes ecopsychology's findings that if we can freely relate to other beings in a more than human world, we have more space to unfold our identities as humans. We are meeting today in the Western Cape, the home of the Khoisans, who understand this interconnectedness and interdependence long before colonial conquest disrupted their way of life. Their respect of other forms of life and life-giving forces such as the sun, wind, water, and the sea enabled them to live healthy lives of gratitude for everything they used. History was made on 1/11/2019, when the South African Minister of Environment, Ms. Barbara Griese, signed an agreement with the local Khoisan leaders under the UN Nagoya Protocol to ensure fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources, specifically where traditional knowledge is concerned. For the first time, they will receive royalties from the patents they own for rooibos or khoisanti as part of their indigenous knowledge. It is inspiring that the visionary founder of the Club of Rome, Aurelia Pache, in a dialogue with Buddhist Daisayi Kida, published as Before It Is Too Late in 1984, and said this: "Only a new humanism, both uncompromising in its ideal motivations and congruent with today's technical realities, can support us in this epical reconquest of ourselves. Only such a humanism, showing that salvation starts within ourselves, can give us the force to reach higher thresholds, allowing us to see alternative paths towards the future." This renaissance of the human spirit in a moment of great distress is what I mean by the human revolution. Our biosphere demands that we open ourselves to this renaissance of the human spirit and re-embrace Ubuntu as the guiding philosophy towards living the truism that the individual can only exist if the whole exists, that the whole can only exist if the individual exists. The good news is that there are numerous communities across this continent amongst the indigenous people in Latin America, Asia, and North America who live this truism. Let's listen to the voices of the Cogui people through our Club of Rome colleagues in Latin America, who have recently announced a declaration of La Guajira, drawing on this wisdom. And we have Antonio here, one of our members over there, who has been very much promoting this unbelievable act of bravery of his colleagues in Latin America, and who are saying very clearly, the world does not have to end. It could continue. But unless you stop violating the earth and nature, unless you cease to deplete the energy of the Great Mother, her organs, her vitality, unless people stop working against the Great Mother, the world will not last. In Zolobeni village in Pondoland in the Eastern Cape, the courageous Amadiba community is fighting off attempts to remove them from their ancestral lands. The High Court of Pretoria ruled in their favor in November 2018. But the government continues to pressure them, and of course we know they're not the only ones who are under pressure from governments who are trying to remove them from their home, from their land. We're seeing similar catastrophes in our rainforest in Brazil, in many other rainforests, and many other ancestral lands across the globe. And I will never forget a friend of mine who comes from a very far Pacific island, who said to me, "Sandrine, you talk about 2050, climate neutrality, the Paris Agreement. What does that mean for me and my ancestors? I live on an island where in the next 5 years I need to decide whether I commit collective suicide with my people on this island because we will no longer be able to survive in order to stay with our ancestors, in order to stay in our ancestral home." We must remember that we are not only destroying nature, we are destroying civilization, ancestors, our link to people, our link to the spirits. Coming back to Mampela's speech, I can do no better than conclude with Aurelia Pache's words. Though these initiatives of the people themselves are scattered and uncoordinated, they offer the most encouraging proof that there is a widespread awakening of public consciousness and a growing demand for a cleaner, more just, and more livable society. All sound seeds for the human revolution. Let us use the opportunities presented by this summit to continue to look deep into ourselves, to embrace a new humanism, Ubuntu, that is essential to enabling us to scan for alternative paths towards the future. We need to explore how we might support these worldwide movements for social and economic justice. We must be bold and lead and work with young people who are seeking this human revolution and a revolution for our planet. Our job is to ensure that we become part of this effort, to underpin the efforts of this nascent human revolution with broad-based intellectual and more coherent political support. Those words from Mampela remind us of how much responsibility we have to be the keepers of humanity and to be the keepers of this planet. The courage of the anti-apartheid movement, the people that lost their lives during that movement, including many of Mampela's friends, and including her beloved partner, Stephen Biko. They truly believed that we all had a necessity to remember to love thy neighbor, that equality would make us all a much more prosperous humanity. This is a vision of what a world can look like here in South Africa, of people that fight together, of all colors, of all cultures, of all faiths. We must remember the words of Emily Dickinson. Love is anterior to life, posterior to death, initial of creation, and the exponent of breath. Love not just to thy neighbor, thy human neighbor, but love to everything that surrounds us. I would like now to have a moment of silence, if I may, in honor of Nobandile Biko and all those that with Mampela have fought to make this country what it is, and that has also given us the inspiration in the countries where we live that actually deep injustice can be undone, not forgotten, but undone. Let's have a moment of silence, please. And now, I would like to invite a fellow traveler who I've only just met, but who I think is also a very important representative of not only the next generation and the importance of the voice of the youth, but also who is deeply tied to this country as the grandson of Nelson Mandela. Luvuyo Madasa. Welcome, Luvuyo. Thank you.
Botani mawethu, molweni. Botani mawethu is welcome my people. We are coming together today as a common people. In this room, we're a family. And families have different generations. Families learn to convey messages through language. Families come together to create understanding through communication and listening. My great-grandfather's name that was given to him when he had made it through initiation into manhood was Dalibunga, the one who brings us to counsel. Today we're in a meeting of a family. Next to you is a brother, a sister, father, grandfather, but a family member. We're here also to have conversations. As important as academic institutions are, sometimes they distort what we're here to do because of the failures of language. Academic institutions teach us to have position papers, which means you come into the conversation having already decided that someone else must move towards you. This is my position, move from where you are and come to me. Ipunga is a conversation amongst family, amongst community, to create understanding. Understanding means that you may need to move from what you thought was your reality to the context that you're engaging with. And as we continue to share the messages that are here today, as people who've traveled from the home that is the world to our specific home that is South Africa, let us remember the messages that we're carrying. Because in messages, it speaks to language, it speaks to legacy, it speaks to communicating into the future, but communicating in the present. We have many generations that are represented here today, and that's important. It's about time we have an intergenerational dialogue about the matters at hand. No finger pointing, no blaming, just questions and answers to create understanding. Some of you have dedicated your lives to this topic. The question is, why hasn't anyone been listening? And maybe we should be spending the time today, tomorrow, and as we leave and go back to our homes, trying to understand why is it that the language of this concerned community isn't landing with those who seem not to care, who seem to continue with the act of being selfish at the expense of not only themselves, but the future generations they claim to be protecting and securing their futures. Let's not do lip service. Let's not say things we do not mean. Let us not say things we don't intend to do. And let's lead by doing. A confession to my peers. Yesterday was a very fascinating conversation. I came in with expectations, and you were teaching me to listen. Thank you. To my elders, we have the energy, we have the intention, we have the commitment. We're here today. The question is, are you going to tell us what to do, or are you going to work with us? Are you going to create an opportunity for understanding, or are you going to dictate to us? And no offense, you were there while these problems were being created. I think it might be time to hand over to those who have the energies possibly to solve them. This is not to say that we don't all take accountability for the world that we live in today. Another limitation of language is that it fails to communicate meaning at times, which is why it's important for us to listen to one another. We all come from different backgrounds. Very many of us are going to be having conversations in language that's not our mother tongue. Be patient with one another. We're all here for the right reasons. The importance is for us to get an understanding of how we can work together and how far we can go on this journey that is about changing our current reality. And lastly, namgelegile. Thank you for trying. Thank you for being brave enough to try. And that's the important part of coming into a community and being intentional about communicating your understanding and what is needed in that space. And lastly, conversations with Dr. Ramphele have been very fascinating. You're probably wondering why a Madasa is, or how is a Madasa related to a Mandela. Ndizalwa intombi kulamzi. Intombi emzini kaGadla, kaDalbhunga, kaZwelvumile, intombi yesibini. I'm born of a daughter of that house. I've listed the names. I can't really translate them, their names. And I used to say, and you'll excuse me for this expression, while growing up, I won the sperm lottery. My dad picked well. And of recent, she corrected me, said, you won the ovarian lottery. Very important. Women nurture. Women grow. And under the leadership of women, the Club of Home must be having conversations about nurturing, about growth, and about taking care of this family that's in this room. Thank you for your bravery. Thank you all for your commitment. And please, listen.
Our summit is now officially open. So welcome to the Club of Home Summit, where we will all spend a day of listening and leave, hopefully, in complete enliveness of the Ubuntu tradition and realize that collectively, through our own individual strengths, we can actually fight for this planet, our home. And not only fight, but hopefully save this planet, our home. I'd like to now move us into our first panel session, which will be expertly driven by our facilitator, Mr. Ian Dunlop. Ian is an esteemed member of the Club of Home, once the Club of Rome, and still the Club of Rome, of course. And Ian will lead us through a discussion around a very important piece of work that we have been doing at the Club of Rome around the climate emergency. And I would like to welcome Ian to the stage, and as he moves to the stage, also indicate that sometimes there are men who don't forget the importance of actually bringing a next generation into this world that understands the depth of the crisis that we are facing. It is my pleasure to actually, even though Ian is in Australia, to work with Ian's daughter, Kirsten Dunlop, and sit on her advisory board at Climate Kick. And Kirsten is a strong believer, the next generation, who has understood the importance of climate emergency. So there are some men as well as women who remember to pass down the lessons of what we must do as good human beings as we try to preserve this planet. Ian, the floor is yours.
Well, welcome everybody, and I thought to start off, the intent is to have a interactive discussion this morning on the questions around the climate emergency, which the Club of Rome, as Sandrine said, has been doing a lot of work on, as we consider this to be an absolutely critical issue. We have a climate emergency plan, which a number of us has contributed to, which was released last year. We also have a planetary emergency plan, of which copies are available, in fact, at the back. And the link between the two we'll come to in the course of the discussion. But I thought just to start this off, what might be useful is just to give a very quick overview of why the Club of Rome considers this to be the absolutely critical issue we now face. The real crux of this problem of course, is the Paris Climate Agreement, which is the, I guess, the institutional framework around which we're all debating climate change. The idea being to limit temperature increase to below 2 degrees C and toward 1.5 if we can possibly do it. And if you look at what's really happening here, the emissions that essentially should have been reducing have been going up continually for the last few decades. We're now at the point where they have to come down very quickly, but at the moment we're on path to a business as usual track, which will see them continually increasing. Even the Paris Agreement commitments that were made will only see emissions level off by 2030. They're not reducing. So if we want to stay below 2 degrees C and even have a 2/3 chance of achieving it, the emissions really have to drop in line with these sort of changes here. So if you want to really look at emergency in a graphical sense, it's quite straightforward. There's a yawning chasm between what we have to do and what was talked about at Paris. We're heading on this track straight up on worst case scenarios, and we quite simply have to go onto that track to bring emissions down by really as soon as possible, whether it's 2030, 2040, you can argue the toss. So the challenge we have is that this really is the greatest emergency, in our view, that humanity's actually ever faced. We have to totally change the approach that humanity has used really over the last 200 years if we're going to address this, and we now have very little time actually in which to do it. So if you just look at the implications of that, we've already seen a 1 degree C temperature increase. 2 degrees C is the upper limit of the Paris Agreement. 3 degrees C is where Paris would bring us to on current commitments, and 4 is where we're currently headed. And the implications of that is we're already seeing tipping points at 1 degree C occurring. At 2 degrees C, it is now the boundary of extremely dangerous climate change. 3 is the opinion of many national security experts, outright social chaos around the world as the impact of extremes hit. And 4 degrees C is basically global collapse. So that's the reality we're facing, which is why you have to reframe, I think, the entire process which the world is taking to deal with this problem. 1.5, there's a lot of talk about trying to achieve that level of temperature increase, a whole lot of effort going into that. The reality is that this picture is really saying that with the many scenarios that are going on, 1.5 is going to get locked in, is going to happen anyway, irrespective of any action we take from now on. The challenge now is to stop going above 2 degrees C or toward 3 and 4. If you look at one of the problems, I think, of a lot of the work that's been done is that we tend to talk in averages, 1.5, 2 degrees C. It doesn't really get to the hard-nosed impact that communities are now faced with. In other words, what is going to happen to sea level increase? What is going to happen to migration? How are farmers going to cope with reduced agricultural productivity? We've attempted to summarize some of these things of the impact of a 3 degree scenario by 2050, which is now quite possible. I won't go into this in detail now, but happy to talk about it offline if need be. But these are the things that people are missing in the current debate. And I think increasingly communities around the world are now having to come to grips with it. Certainly in Australia that is the case. And at 4 degrees C you see even more massive change. So the basic steps that have to be taken, these are just summarised from the climate emergency plan the Club of Rome put together. But the bottom line of all of this, without dwelling on the detail, is that we have to stop the expansion of fossil fuel use. And in fact, we have to go beyond that and start to see it reduce extremely quickly. That's the one overriding issue that, above all else, is the only thing is going to stop us getting above 2 degrees C or thereafter. You can talk about all the other things which are extremely important, but the one thing is that emissions have to come down. So if you look at the context of what's now happening, we're seeing the physical impacts and the costs escalating all around the world. And this is now real. It's now being borne by taxpayers in many countries, and individuals obviously are being affected. There's a recognition of the emergency increasingly around the world. But so far, that's mainly about declarations. It's not talking about action. And the real issue is, how do we get action? So investors, banks, insurers are now under great pressure to withdraw from fossil fuels, and a lot of very good work is going on in trying to achieve that, and a lot of it's been quite successful. The regulators and the financial markets are demanding now that climate risk be incorporated in financial analysis and in disclosure to stock exchanges. The fossil fuel companies, most of them, still appear to be intent on expansion, notwithstanding the implications of actually doing that. On the other hand, we're seeing low-carbon solutions emerging very rapidly, which are undermining the economics of fossil fuels in many countries. So there is a market impact occurring. In terms of government responses, it's very mixed. The fossil fuel-rich economies are still resisting strongly, Australia, the US, and Canada. In Asia, there's a varying response, and I think the idea of an emergency is not really accepted yet in Asia, even though the impacts are being seen. Obviously, some countries are doing a lot, like China, but on the other hand, China is also building a lot of coal-fired power stations, so that doesn't necessarily help. In Europe, I think the emergency call is being taken up gradually, but within countries, you're now finding that states and local governments are ignoring national policies and starting to do things on their own. And finally, community anger and pressure, I think, at global inaction is really growing. So school children strikes, the Greta Thunberg phenomena, if you like to call it that, the Extinction Rebellion. Civil disobedience pressure is basically rising. But the problem is that all of this is fine, but what we're not seeing is emissions come down. So I guess the question for today is, what is the perspective from Africa? I've not talked quite deliberately about Africa in this list, because I think that's what we'll hear from our speakers. We're learning from Africa, I think, in these 2 days. So I'm looking forward to that discussion, to seeing how we can put all this together, and the ideas that might be available on how we can speed up this process. And indeed, do you agree with it? I mean, do we actually accept that emergency is really the situation we face? The 2 papers, I think the Planetary Emergency paper is at the back. The Club of Rome Emergency Plan is available online. And on that basis, I'd like to then move quickly into our discussion, as we have limited time. So I'd like to invite first up Edgar Pieterse to give us the opening presentation. Edgar, I think you have the CV in the program ahead of you. Founding Director of the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town, and obviously involved in a wide range of social and economic discussions around that whole urban concept. So I think I'll leave it at that, and Edgar invites you to the podium to take over.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the privilege and the honor to be part of this panel and to bring a very specific aspect of the larger African debate into this question on the climate emergency. So if we take the opening remarks that was just made, at the core of that is that we've got to radically rethink investment, how we invest in the way we live, how we invest in how we build, how we invest in the infrastructure that conducts materials and resources that enables our livelihoods. And of course, since we have a larger trend towards people moving towards cities, and that will be about 70% of the 9 billion people by 2050, Africa is a very interesting case study in this larger context, because we are only 40% urbanized at the moment, and by 2050, we will have gone past that 50% tipping point. But what is more significant is even though we're already 40% urbanized, the current urban fabric only accommodates for about 40% of the urban population, right? Because of a lack of basic services, a lack of infrastructure, and so forth. So effectively, in this window that we have to address the climate emergency between now and 2050, as framed by the IPCC reports, we have to find ways of creating a livable way for the majority of Africans to live, not just for the trebling of the urban population over the next 40 years or 30 years, but also for the 60% of the existing population that live in subhuman conditions in most of our cities. So that's the connection with the climate question. So if we are going to think about the future and how we are going to realize the necessary transitions that are spoken about, the urbanization imperative and how we respond to that is absolutely at the core of the ideas that have to be generated from this place into the global discussion. So it is specifically about the specificities of what I call makeshift urbanization in Africa, and what's the interface with the climate change mitigation adaptation imperatives, as we've just heard. Now, in the African context, there are two overriding things. One is we are confronted by a condition of extreme economic vulnerability and dependence. Even though we are almost 20% of the global population, we account for 4% of global trade, and we only account for 2.5% of global output. And that trend, that proportion, has flatlined over the last 40 years, and all indicators suggest that that will remain the case for the future. So where are the resources, the wealth, the assets going to come from to respond to this significant population growth? To compound that, we generally have, as a generalization, unfit, as in not fit for purpose, but also lopsided governance structures in that we have highly centralized states that actively undermine the capacity and the possibility of strong local governments on the continent. This is an overgeneralization, but we're speaking about 54 states, so obviously I'm going to have to generalize to make a point. So keep that in mind. This is just the high-line numbers on the urbanization expansion in Africa. Between now and 2050, all urban growth will be concentrated in Africa and in Asia. Africa's rate of urban growth is the highest of any world region in the world. What is significant about this chart is that most of the urban growth will be in Western, Central, and Eastern Africa. We've kind of exhausted the urban transition in Northern Africa and Southern Africa. And so we are looking at regions where you've got GDP per capita still well below $1,200 per person, and you have massive, massive, large-scale precarious employment. Now, what is really crucial to get into the hearts and minds and the headspace of the African policymakers on how to respond to this is that Africa is struggling not just with responding to demographic pressures, but it is also really, really struggling to make the transition into an industrial and manufacturing economy. It is just not happening. It's what we call structural transformation in the parlance of Agenda 2063, which is the overarching vision of African leaders for where Africa should be by 2063. Now, the reason for this are these trend lines. So as you can see, from the 1980s onwards, so that's the onset of structural adjustment in the global south and particularly in Africa, you will see that at that point manufacturing was 53% of total value add, and that has declined up until now to only 25%. And this is in a context where 50% of our population is younger than 19 years of age, and so you can imagine what is happening. We're going to see a trebling of the labor force between now and 2050. And this is the peculiarity of Africa. So the graph on the left shows you the typical labor market transition in most regions of the world historically, and that is simply not happening in Africa. So what we do have is a transition from informal agriculture, in other words, large-scale subsistence farming and so forth, into informal trading in urban areas and towns and informal service economies, right? So that's the predominant condition. Now, at the moment, in terms of the rules of the game, of whether it's trade, whether it is all kinds of global economic regulatory frameworks, there is nothing in any of that that can help us to shift this transition. And the implications are profoundly spatial, they're profoundly urban. This is just the last slide to drive that point home. This is the labor market growth for sub-Saharan Africa projected up to 2050. And as you can see, it far exceeds any other region, but it is into a context where there are no decent job opportunities. So how do we connect the employment question with the climate question, right? That's obviously, and what I'm suggesting is that there's a spatial dimension to that that we have to come to terms with. Now, this is the policy frame of African leaders at the moment, Agenda 2060. I shouldn't just say leaders, I should say of Africans. And at the heart of that is a fairly classic modernization argument. We've got to improve productivity in agriculture so that it becomes a declining share of GDP and employment. And with that, you'll see a rise in industrial and service sectors. You'll have a drop of birth rates and death rates. And through a productive urbanization, you kind of have a stabilization and a gradual increase and so forth of standards of living. So that's what that's the headspace, that's what they're working on, and the backstory to that is structural transformation, and all policy heads are focused on that at the moment. We're not making fantastic progress, but it is focusing the minds, let me put it that way. Whether this is even appropriate in 2020 is another question. Whether this is appropriate in the context of a climate emergency is something for us to debate in this panel. What that leads to, though, is this kind of imagination. This is PwC's understanding of how African cities should transition. And as you can see, it has this idea of survival, basic needs, the advanced city, and then eventually you get to quality of life when everybody's wealthy enough and you can go and live in your gated green building council estate and everything is hunky-dory. Now, the problem with that is that it creates this kind of imagination. This is Eco Atlantic in Lagos. That is Quilamba that is already built with Chinese finance in Luanda in Angola. This is what has happened over the last decade across the continent, a proliferation of these, what is called fantasy cities, right? And of course, on the ground, they look very different. This is taken by a photographer just 2 months ago of Eco Atlantic, and it gives you an idea of the dissonance between the speculative ambition and the materiality of our real estate economies in African cities. But the point about this is that it sucks all of the investment capital out of the room. And it is absolutely preoccupies the imaginations of our policy leaders, and it is a massive, wasteful destruction, but it is hardwired because this is what we think is modernity. So, as I've already intimated, not only does it only cater for, I'm being very generous here by saying 20% of the population, but what is more insidious is that it criminalizes the livelihood practices of the majority of urban dwellers. People who work informally, who hustle informally, who've got to keep food on the table. But furthermore, because there's now a lack of adequate basic services and so forth, what you see is that we are not doing the strategic investments to reap the benefits of a youth dividend, right? We are simply not creating an enabling environment for that. So, can the climate emergency catalyze an alternative urban development framework? That's what we are wrestling with across the continent. So, of course, what was significant about the 1.5-degree report is that it brought the urban catalytic power to the fore. And so I'll draw on a report that we contributed to, where we try to extrapolate from the 1.5-degree report what are the key takeaways for urban policymakers. And again, all of these are, of course, available for download. And at the heart, of course, of the 1.5 report are 4 system transitions: energy, land and ecosystems, urban and infrastructure, and industry. The report then continues to provide, as it does with these things, incredibly detailed policy entry points around energy transitions, around urban infrastructure, around industrial systems, and the list goes on in terms of how we can think of land and ecosystem transitions. And of course, many people in the room, and certainly from the youth summit that I attended parts of yesterday, are actively engaged at a micro scale, at a project level, in these experiments. And that is absolutely crucial and vital. However, what I would argue is that if you look across all of these interventions, they all assume a capable state with intent and with the capacity to work with civil society and the private sector to generate context-specific experiments to figure out how to do these things. So if we ask the question, this state-driven policy agenda, is it feasible in Africa? As far as I'm concerned, reading the landscape at the moment and working with various Pan-African governance policy forums, the answer is no. We just don't have the institutional wherewithal to begin to deal with this. So I am not going to speak to the specificities of the South African context. I'm happy to do that in the debate, and I'm sure some of my panelists will take issue with this assertion. But I'm trying to think of it in terms of these three factors. We've got very limited democratic decentralization and fiscal devolution in 90% of African states. There is a profound disconnect between macroeconomic programming, which sets the agenda and the funding priorities for the state, and urban development. It's as if the two operate, along with climate plans, in different universes. And since the regulatory power of the state is limited, simply because the majority of the society exists within other parallel, a multiplicity of regulatory frameworks that are informal, criminal, whatever you want to call them, of course, a rules-driven regulatory approach to get these systemic changes isn't really an option for us, right? That is not going to work. You can't just pass a law and a set of regulations and our society is going to follow suit. It does not work like that when the majority of the society, the majority of the economy, the majority of how people live is non-formal, right? So where does this leave us? How do we think differently about an alternative? And can we step off the imaginary bus of modernity and think how we work with the resources that we have? So a couple of points and then I'll conclude. So firstly, there's a lot in the current ferment of the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and New Urban Agenda that helps us, I think, to hone a set of aspects of that that is absolutely pivotal for the Africa transition. The first is the pivot towards the green economy. The second is to think social inclusion as access to basic services, because those are the fundamentals to realize human capital. And jobs, 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 right? We have to be absolutely obsessed across all of the economic sectors, formal, informal, social sectors, about how we enhance labor productivity. And that doesn't necessarily mean a formal job. And lastly, institutional competence. And here, again, I'm not just talking about the state. Our private sector institutions leave much to be desired for. Civil society organizations are often not able to respond to the challenges at the scale at which they manifest. Brilliant at experimenting at the micro scale, but not so fantastic at articulating that into a societal vision that can mobilize in a way that will drag the state in its wake. And so a couple of key concepts maybe is enough for now to help us to create a framework within which multiple experiments can unfold. And as we learn by doing, we can begin to theorize and conceptualize that. So hybrid infrastructures and systems are clearly the name of the game. Because when we don't have universal energy grids, we don't have universal access to sanitation, we don't have mobility systems that can move people around safely and affordably, people hustle. People step into the breach and they create a solution. We have to recognize the ingenuity and the institutional intelligence in that and try and aggregate it into systems to look at how we create interoperable dynamics between these makeshift responses and formal technical solutions, whether it is renewable or not. Localization and circularity, that was referenced. I'll skip over that and I'll just quickly conclude by saying that sustainable infrastructure for me has to be the entry point in relation to the climate emergency. In our context, it has to not just mean low carbon, resource efficient, but absolutely be about social inclusivity and spatial integration or spatial justice. And so the two key ideas are spatial ideas. Radical localization, where we understand that we can begin to enhance dramatically through digital enablement the initiatives of grassroots households, families, firms, communities, and then recognizing that certain things require a metropolitan scale to achieve systemic transitions. So at the regional scale, these three systems are critical. I won't go into the detail, we can discuss. But the beauty of them is that they create entry points for investment into land markets that opens up the possibility of fiscal income for the local state to be able to then do other things, right? So, but to think about alternative infrastructure responses, reimagining the functioning of land markets in relation to a civic commons, but also the possibility of generating revenue streams so that we can have more autonomy and more possibility. None of that is possible without the investment in active regional innovation systems between communities, civil society, universities, the private sector, and the state. Localization, very simply, I'm not going to read all of this, is just the idea that we can deal with these massive deficits by creating social enterprises at the neighborhood scale that can in turn value, can be prefigurative of what the circular economy could look like. And I'll end off with one very practical example to show that. This is a project where, not too far from here in Cape Town, they figured out how to wood chip alien invasive trees. Any alien in the Western Cape context consumes 100 times more water than any other kind of indigenous plant. So this technology allows for the aliens to be cleared through public works, to be wood chipped, mixed with a 10% cement slurry. So you can imagine the carbon performance of that building material is dramatically better than conventional construction technology. And then build public housing with a gang of 10 people in a week with no mechanical aspects to the construction. And that is the kind of building that you can then generate. This is the material, and it tests off the roof on all the technical metrics. So in conclusion, since we have emergent experiments in this direction, and I've just cited one very brief example, but I've heard many, many, many yesterday in the Youth Summit, on the fringes of the mainstream across the continent, how do we accelerate the growth of adaptive leaders alongside the circulation of useful knowledge to be impactful in context and shift larger frames of recognition and value? So this is not, for me, a technical question about understanding the minutiae of climate science. This is about recognizing a different kind of leadership anchored in context that can see how what is happening on the ground is prefigurative of what Africa can and should become. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Edgar, for that presentation. We now have a series of responses, and I might call on Dickinson and Naidoo perhaps to make the first response. You happy to talk from here?
Sure.
Yep.
Any way you like. Good morning, everyone. I'm on PowerPoint rehab. It's my first day of being sober. It's been a fascinating morning. In fact, these views aren't in my usual discussion. So it's been very refreshing. But I want to begin with some very uncomfortable and inconvenient truths. The first of those inconvenient truths is that in 2019, the colonization project is as alive as it ever was. The elephant in the room, I think, that was missing in Edgar's presentation is that this continent, which without doubt represents mankind's best opportunity to move into a low-carbon economy world over, is not being allowed to do that. African governments do not control their budgets. African governments do not control their policies. Africa continues to be that place in the world, like Latin America, that serves the extractive means for the global north. We have to deal with that. We can walk around and wag our fingers at all of the policies that have not come to fruition, but even with the best foot forward, it's not easy to do this because the north does not play this game. The second issue is that the fossil fuel economy is unbelievably well embedded. It is by far the most successful economy in our history. You and I, as we're sitting here, are active funders of the fossil fuel economy. Surely you know this. If you look at your pension funds, I imagine pretty high up on those pension funds are our own investments in oil and gas, and of course our own investments in tobacco, because that's what the asset managers tend to choose. So if any of you thought that you weren't part of the problem, believe me, we absolutely are. So what are the ways out of this? The limitations are no longer science and technology. Science and technology has demonstrated that we have the scientific know-how and the technological means to actively have globally a very fruitful and a very successful low-carbon economy. It's the technology lock into the system that it continues to be the bugbear. Let me give you an example. We have, as a small country, with several international partners and the Gates Foundation, on the back of a global program called Reinvent the Toilet, devised completely new toilet systems, some of which use alien vegetation as the house. And this completely new sanitation technology gives you three very important things. The first thing is that it uses no water. And seeing that sanitation uses approximately 30% of the water in every building that it's in, it's a huge water saving. And there's a concomitant energy saving that goes along with that, and you already go to a lower carbon option. But over and above that, the waste from that sanitation can be beneficiated. And that beneficiation allows you to produce new renewable energy from human waste, as an example. Why have we not been able to roll it out? The biggest toilet program in the world today has been in India, on the back of something called Swachh Bharat. In a matter of 5 years, and this is absolutely amazing, 110 million new toilets were built in India, and that serviced around 600 million people. 600 million people went from open defecation to having an improved service. The problem is it locked itself into the same technology that we're all currently locked in, and that's the sewage system. The sewage system that demands energy, the sewage system that brings up our carbon budget. So even when we have the best of intentions to move, we're locked into this paradigm. This Africa is a greenfield site. It's predicted that by 2050, this continent will have 50 megacities. And of these 50 new megacities, only 5 are on the brink of being one. And about 20 more are what we would now consider small towns. So if we introduced resource-sensitive design into these cities, and if we were allowed to by the international institutions that fund us, these are the likes of the World Bank, the likes of the African Development Bank, the likes of the DBSA, the likes of the Chinese Construction Bank, then maybe we can make that transition. And we can demonstrate it at a scale that allows the rest of the world to make this macro transition around really organizing for us to be in a genuine low-carbon economy. But the economic will to do so is very limited. It's extraordinarily limited. And we've come up against this barrier all of the time. This country, in the run-up to the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development, developed the first template in the world of a national strategy for sustainable development. We're sitting 17 years on with very limited implementation because we were locked in already to so many international agreements and mechanisms, be they associated with loan agreements or long-term development agreements, that we have not been actually able to move. So the problem is a very big one, and the problem needs a global solidarity to help it to move to the right place. Let me talk very briefly about water and energy. Water is a great user of energy, you will know this. In the way that we currently work, we're organized to work with distance. We take water from far away, purify it using a lot of energy, transport it to where we need to use it, and then we take the waste and we do the entire thing in reverse. It's a heavy energy user. There are 3 things in the water system that will fundamentally change that. The first of those things is organizing, because we have the technology to do so now, to be able to purify on site. We no longer have to make water delivery a logistics nightmare. And that's your first energy saving. The second is we need to convert our wastewater treatment plants into energy plants, because that's what they actually are. Currently, we're just not capturing that energy. And I'm not talking about being rudimentary around taking sludge and burning it and using it as charcoal. Yes, you can do that. But we're much more sophisticated now. We can now extract the biogas out of it, and we can go even further. We can even pull out of fecal sludge. We can pull out liquid fuel. We can pull out biodiesel. And in this country, we have 3 demonstrator plants and 1 company that's already running doing this. So there is a significant fuel source associated with this. And this is the way we can move into the system. And then we can use the reticulation systems that we've already constructed and derive the energy out of that. Because moving water is a wonderful source of energy. In fact, on Earth, after fire, it was the first source of energy we used. It's hydro. And using hydro at mini scales and at conduit scales inside pipelines will organize for the water sector to be completely energy self-sufficient. So the energy transition component of the emergency plan has a fulfillment opportunity inside water. There are a couple of other examples I can talk to, but maybe I can come back to them in a bit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Dhesigen. Very interesting. I think that's raised some very interesting issues about how climate change emergencies might fit into making that sort of transition, which we might come back to. But now I'd like to ask Henk Rogers to give us a different perspective on the work he's been doing around the world and in Hawaii particularly on the climate emergency.
Yeah, so I'm not originally from Hawaii, I'm from the Netherlands, but I live in Hawaii. I've lived there for 17 years now. I have a foundation in Hawaii working to end the use of carbon-based fuel. How do we do this? Hawaii spends $5 billion a year on oil, $5 billion with a B. Approximately 2 million people spending that money. 30% goes to jet fuel, 30% goes to ground transportation, 40% goes to electricity. So we decided that the first thing we would do is attack the biggest one, which is the electricity production. And again, 40% of that imported oil goes to making energy. And basically, how do we attack that? First of all, if you're going to go off-grid, which is what we need to do in Hawaii, off-grid means off of fossil fuel. Of course, efficiency is the number one. It's the easiest one. So what does that mean? 40% of for example, of air conditioning, of electricity goes to air conditioning. Can you imagine that? And for residential, it's 30% goes to heating hot water. So we passed a law in Hawaii saying that every new home that gets built has to have a solar hot water heater. How hard is that? Instead of using oil to make hot water, we use the solar to make hot water. We passed laws in Hawaii to promote solar panels on rooftop solar panels. And there was a sort of a rebate from the government saying you put solar panels on your roof, you get 30% back of the money. And by the way, we started, in our calculation, we thought we were going to have 30 megawatts of solar, rooftop solar in like 3 years. The total electric consumption in Hawaii is about it's a little over 2.3, 2.4 gigawatts. That's 24,000 megawatts. And so with 30 megawatts is what? It's just maybe slightly over 10%. Well, in 3 years, we had 300 megawatts of rooftop solar. So that was a hugely successful thing. And then the electric company says, wait, we cannot handle so much electricity, so much variable. Because the problem with solar is it goes up and down with the clouds and the sun and all of that. And so it's difficult for the electric company to predict what's going to happen. And so you get voltage imperfections and so on, and bursts. So basically the electric company says, okay, no more rooftop solar. We're done, pretty much. And they stopped giving out permits to connect to the grid. So I thought, okay, I'm going to figure this out. What's the solution to that? And so on a personal level, because I've made some money in the past making computer games, so I can do things that other people can't do. So I said, I'm going off grid. And the idea is to figure out how to go off grid, because then I can have solar panels, even though the electric company says no. So I took my ranch off grid. And we went through several battery techniques, because you need batteries. So if you're going to have solar, live on solar, you only get your energy during the daytime. What do you do at night? The answer is you have to have batteries, or you have to have some other backup. And if the grid is not there for your backup, then you have to store the energy yourself. So we searched around the world for batteries that we liked. And when I say like, I don't want the solution to become the next problem. You know, this is, when you think about it, you know, cars were a solution to methane-producing horses back in, you know, turn of last century. Yes, it's a 20-fold reduction in how can I say, greenhouse gases. But the problem is now that we have billion cars, now that's become a huge problem. And so what we don't want to do is in our rush to come up with a solution, create the next big problem. Lead acid, of course, is the worst technology. I mean, lead and acid, evil and evil. So you don't want to go lead acid. They only last a couple of years, and then the leftovers of those batteries get sent to, in our case in the United States, it gets sent to Mexico, and children break them open and get the lead back, which is horrible, horrible, horrible. The batteries I have in my phone, you have in your phone, or in my car, I drive electric car, are lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese. And everybody here, because cobalt comes from Africa, knows what cobalt is. And it probably doesn't do a nice thing where it's mined. But the real problem with lithium cobalt is the cobalt is an unstable chemical. And if you puncture your battery, it will catch on fire. And this is not a fire, this is like fireworks. It will go and go and go until the chemical is completely used up. And so we're basically at the very beginning of the adoption of this technology, and the news about how dangerous these batteries are and how environmentally unfriendly they are has been kept quiet, pretty much by the industry. If I have a Tesla battery in my house and my house burns down, Tesla comes with a big bag of money and says, here, take this money. Just the deal is that you don't talk about it in the press. So we haven't really heard the story. In Korea, there were 13 industrial fires, meaning that they have batteries inside of their company, mostly in containers outside the company, but they've caught on fire and again, burned down to the ground. And the Korean government has said, no more, you stop installing these batteries. The batteries that we landed on, I'm not saying it's the end, is lithium iron phosphate. Lithium and iron and phosphate are all chemically benign. So when you look at my batteries at my house or at on my ranch, there's no cooling system. And that is no moving parts. And so really nothing can go wrong. You can puncture it, you can set it on fire, and it's not going to contribute to a fire. That's just on the storage side. So I, as an individual, have gone off grid, and so that's my home situation. Then I bought electric cars, so I'm ground transportation, I'm zero. I made, it could be a moment of strength or a moment of weakness. Last New Year's, I said, I'm going to become sustainable this year. And this is something, well, you say, okay, you're a high net worth individual, you can do this, but actually, no, that's not true. We can all make this pledge to go sustainable. And we have to think about what does it even mean for me to go sustainable? And first of all, my house and my home already there, my ground transportation already there. So what's left is like, oh my God, my garbage. It's horrible. You know, I look at the garbage, we separate everything, and I at my ranch, and I ask my guy, so where does the garbage go? Where does the plastic go? So, well, it goes to Waimea. So what happens to it in Waimea? Well, in the old days, it was collected and it was sent to China, but China doesn't take our plastic anymore. So where does it go now? And I says, well, as far as I know, there's no containers or ships leaving the big island of Hawaii with plastic. So that means it stays on the big island. So where does it go? And the answer is, unfortunately, I believe the answer is that it gets landfilled together with all the other things I separate. So I separate the plastic, separate the glass, and separate everything, and it all gets dumped together. And it's like, seriously? How ridiculous is that? Yeah. So he's giving me the signal. So, so what I'm trying to say is that not only can we as individuals make a decision to go sustainable, and this is the kind of decision that everybody in the world needs to make. We can wait for our governments to go from the top down and tell us this is what you do, and this is what we're going to do, but the real change is going to happen when we all decide that we are going to become sustainable.
Well, thanks, Henk. I think that is a very appropriate remark to end on. We are a bit tight for time, but Noam, I'll ask you just to give us a very brief response to the discussion you've heard thus far, before we ask Samantha to give us a... I'll give you...
I don't know how to respond to some of these comments, but I was committed to talk about the shared economy as a option for climate change amelioration. So we heard. I think it's very pleasant to talk to preach to the choir over here. You know, so we have a very friendly crowd which understands sustainability and the dangers of what is happening with the global warming and the climate change issues. So the remedy to all this, all the remedies proposed by Ian's report and some others are also very severe. They are associated with the severe consequences financially and climatically and so on. So we have to find all different ways to deal with this. And as you understand, reducing fossil fuel use from the engineering standpoint is very difficult because, as you said, you know, it's a very established, efficient economy. And getting rid of coal is going to deprive more than 50% of the world's population from the only fuel that they can use nowadays. And so there are, and of course financially, as you mentioned, we are going to lose our pensions, and so if it's not taken care of in a proper way. So we have to find different ways to deal with climate change, and one small or maybe a bigger issue, bigger remedy has to do with the so-called shared economy. Shared economy is the exchange of goods and services between entities or individuals, which altogether improves the efficiency of the system, reduces embodied energy, reduces embodied emissions, creates employment, and so on. So we have been working on the effect of the shared economy on the electrical market. The electrical market itself is undergoing a big change because of the advent of more and more renewable energy. So the systems, it's not only deregulation, but it's also a completely different concept of energy generation, which is also minimizes at the same time the undesirable emissions. And especially within the short time that I have. It is of great interest in Africa. Apparently, about 40% of African households belong to some cooperative or another. Cooperatives are an old invention, probably started with the advent of humanity. The original sharing was mostly based on agriculture, but the sharing is now extended, and not just in Africa, in the entire world, to many different dimensions. And to mention briefly Uber and Airbnb and so on. Basically, it's a sharing that takes advantage of the idle assets and generation capacity. And the sharing is facilitated in an incredibly efficient way by digital platforms. So people can share and exchange things very, very easily and cheaply. The idea of cooperatives in shared economy is also exemplified by the fact that women in Africa, for example, now have at least 50% of the participation in various cooperatives. So it's a familiar system for Africa. It doesn't always work well, but potentially it can. It needs regulation, much more regulation than it has now. And also government planning for that. But this clearly will reduce emissions and reduce the embodied energy in idle equipment and facilities. To build a house takes about 20 times more energy than the house uses over its lifetime.
Norm, I think we might just leave it at that if we could at this stage, because we're going to run a bit short of time.
Yes, so actually that's about all I wanted to say. So I'd like to promote the idea of shared economy, which also promotes social cohesion and integration. Sustainability, I look at it, we do quantification of sustainability and do an analysis. Sustainability is sitting to the way I look at it, on these three pillars, which is the environmental, economical, and social. And so I always get offended by people talking about green this or green that. You can't be just green. You have to also have the social and economic pillars considered. So the social pillar is really important, and that's exemplified by this shared economy as one example. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it's going to help in reaching.
Thanks, Norm. I think that's great concept on the shared economy perspective is going to be increasingly important. So thanks for the comments. Because we're a bit tight for time, I would like to get Samantha's view on the younger person's perspective on all of the things we've heard. So over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Samantha. I'm from Singapore. Half Indian and half Chinese.
They're not hearing you.
We're not hearing me.
That's fine, I think it's fine.
My name is Samantha. This is poetic because we've not been heard.
Yeah.
I'm from Singapore, so I don't necessarily represent the global south from that perspective. I'm half Indian and I'm half Chinese, and I'm all about sustainable Southeast Asia. That's what I'm about. I work in the field of urban sustainability, so I represent a lot of the youth today who talk about urgency, who talk about frustration, who talk about anxiety, who talk about depression. And we're tired. I think everybody has heard this before. I'm not here to represent the young climate activists, even though I count myself as one. I'm here to represent the youth that were in the room yesterday, trying to understand the issues that we're facing on the global scale and what kind of power that we have to deal with that. I am the first, I guess, today to talk to you from the youth perspective, so I understand that is a huge pressure. Please forgive me for what I'm about to say. Firstly, we know we have the technology. The issue is in adoption, the issue is in change management, and the issue is in inclusivity. We need real workable alternatives, not high-tech, high-cost. What we're looking for is low-tech, low-cost, because we have no money and no power. The role of the sustainability experts is not to talk about how we can move to a better society. The role of the sustainability experts is to help individual businesses, communities, and people understand how to make more sustainable decisions, whatever decisions those are. So when we talk about technology being available, we know that. You have to include the sustainability experts when you're making any form of decision, because one technology doesn't mean that it's better than another, depending on the context that we have to really consider. What I've not heard enough today is about contextualization. The sharing economy is one example of a very local context that brings in external values that we have not yet mentioned today, such as empathy and being able to see the other human being. This, the subconscious, is important in how we drive sustainability, and we haven't mentioned it at all in this conversation. So I have 3 things to say from the youth. The first thing is what we have. We have the drive to bring about systems change. We have the perspectives, the purpose, and the potential. We have new ways of collaboration and doing business. We need mentorship, leadership. We need to develop ourselves as people. We need representation at global conversations. This conversation cannot happen without us. We need the space to experiment, the ability to have access to different forms of resources in order to try things out for our contexts, for our communities. We need to act collectively with humility, with empathy, and above all, with urgency. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Samantha. I think you've highlighted a number of key issues that indeed we hadn't raised. The intent certainly of the climate emergency discussion was to convey the sense of urgency that the problem is actually much bigger, I think, than we are being told officially. All of those points I think you raised come very much into the solution to the problem. The question, I guess, is the extent to which accelerating that process is going to be driven, certainly a major component of it, by the younger community, enforcing the pace of change with all the things you've talked about. So I think that's a major topic for the rest of the day. The idea of our climate emergency was that it of itself, it's the one thing we have to fix if we want a viable future, but there are obviously a range of many other things which are reflected in the Planetary Emergency paper we produced. But you have to get the climate right initially. We've got a limited amount of time for questions, so what I'd like to do is to really get some responses from the audience to the points that have been made, particularly from the younger people. there are questions that you're burning to raise at this point. I think we've got about 10 minutes or thereabouts. So could I just open the floor for discussion as to who would like to make some comments at this point? Anybody with a burning question that we have?
There's a question.
Right, where are we?
Another one over there.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Derek Mugisha from Uganda. I would not say I'm proud to be here because I represent a bigger voice of around 2,000 plus youth that I work with. I'm not here to get hope. I'm just here to get the commitment from all of us. We come from different diversity and backgrounds. And for us as youth, we have heard a lot. We have read a lot of research papers. We have read a lot of books from the experts, from the technical people. But what lacks is your commitment. Because we do a lot of the writing, we do a lot of the talking, but you have not yet committed. And I've not heard from the discussions the commitment. What next? You've given us the solutions. You've told us how Africa's climate context is. What is the commitment? Like each panelist, if at least you could give us a commitment. Personally, I'm interested in the financing because the youth I represent have the ideas. They have the ideas of things they want to do or things they want to see change. But I think it's high time we also have financial commitments. Our country is burdened because they always complain about the resource. They'll say, if you have this idea, like, we don't have the money to finance you. How are you going to raise this money? I'm interested as a young man, how my ideas are going to be financed. At least if I get the commitment of the financing, like from this discussion, the intergenerational discussion of, yeah, we shall finance your ideas as young people. If you bring this or if you have such a process, then we shall be at least motivated to do more because we need more of the youth actions. But again,
Okay,
they are not
thanks.
motivated.
I think
Thank you.
we get the concern. Is there anybody like to make a response to that?
Don't you want to
Maybe we
get
should
the
select a
sweep?
couple and then.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure. Any other question over here? I think?
Good morning. My name's Nioka. I'm here as a representative from the company I'm at, but this is a personal response that I'd like to address. So when I saw the program, I've been working in the climate space for the last 7 years, and I was really excited, but then I saw the gender imbalance of the panel, and I'm so grateful for Samantha today because I was really upset because I thought, how can we be talking about a climate emergency when 50% of the population globally, when we talk about vulnerable communities, is not represented on a panel, and we're talking about urgency. So that's my response. So thank you so much, Samantha. I really appreciate it, and I also know that it's a huge responsibility for Samantha to be representing the youth voice and the only female on the panel.
Thank you. Okay, thanks for the comment. Point noted, I think. Where are we?
Here.
This one.
Hello, everyone. My name's Ola Kiaswa, and I am currently an environmental entrepreneur looking at ways and solutions to address climate change issues, looking at specifically urban agriculture and building social cohesion around that. So I'm tied to, I wear a lot of hats. I'm tied to a lot of organizations. And currently I'm under a startup ecosystem. So looking at the panel today, sorry, sir, but my colleague there, I'd like to stress what he's saying because I believe it's very important for young people to be given a chance to actually show how can we possibly find solutions because we are the ones who are experiencing climate change and we know how to sort it out. So where are the accelerators? Where are the seed investors? Where are the angel investors? We need these people for trial and error. We need to practice, we need to make mistakes, but we believe in our solutions and we need the older people, the foundations, the institutions to back us up despite of our failures.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think maybe at this point we might just get some responses from the panel here. Some of the points you've raised will of course come up in terms of financing and other things in the discussions later today, which are specifically looking at those sorts of requirements. But I might ask Edgar or Dhesigen initially if you have any comments, or Samantha.
Sure. Well, it's good to see that the youth have stood up and have spoken. Let me say something on behalf of Mompela, without her permission, but I've done this before. She will forgive me. We come from a different struggle era in this country as youth activists. There was a time when Crane sitting over there had hair. The thing that always gets me is a very different kind of boundary conditions that are being demanded by the youth of today. We did not ask for that. And even if we did, it would not have been given. There was an apartheid system, and the apartheid machinery wasn't just South African. It was a global project. Let's be clear about that. So when I hear youth asking for these boundary conditions, I'm a little bit disturbed because I want for you to have much more resilience than that. It shouldn't matter what I say. If you believe strongly in what you want to do, you break the barriers and make that happen. You don't ask me for a commitment. You come and break down my door and you tell me what you want and demand it. I rely on you to be the vanguard of the change that we all need to see. Your leadership is not tomorrow. You're right about that. Your leadership is today. And you have to stand up and you have to take it. On the specifics, there are some mechanisms we have created locally and globally that can assist with some of these things, but you have to be out there. You have to be out there, you have to be forceful, you have to get a little bit unpopular, because you have right on your side, and that should not be underestimated.
Thanks, Dhesigen. I think we are reaching the point where I've been given strict instructions that we have to break for tea. So I think what we might do is wrap this up at this point, because a number of these questions flow on into what's going to happen later in the day, logically. But I guess to me, just trying to draw this to a head, the key issue for me is the extent to which the community response to the emergency we face now is really going to start to strengthen in a constructive sense in trying to drive this change. Because I think, as a number of our panelists have talked about, the capacity of governments to actually handle this challenge is severely limited, I think, in the world we are now in. And that's not just a question, I think, in Africa. That's also a major issue in the developed democracies, particularly the ones who are fossil fuel bound, if I can use that terminology. So I look forward to continuing this discussion. Toward the end of the day, it'd be good to actually bring us to some sort of crux as to the steps that might be taken in an African context and how that might actually help. I mean, whether the climate emergency can actually drive the sorts of change I think Edgar and Dhesigen and Samantha and so on have been talking about. So look, thank you very much for your participation. I'd just like to thank the panel for putting in the effort they have. And we look forward to continuing a discussion through the day. Thank you very much indeed, and we now break for tea, I think, actually, except that we have I think we have a few gifts for the panelists. Thank you very much.